Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Joanna and Ian. This is our session on the economics of programmatic with a slant on identity, of course, which is the core of everything. So I wanted to first welcome the two of you and just a quick little intro. So I think a lot of folks know who both of you are. So Joanna O'Connell, I love your LinkedIn blurb at the top, digital advertising wonk and professionally opinionated, which is it's so perfect. It's great. And you've got a lot of great research, obviously, in your background, which goes all the way back to the days of Razorfish and then your stint at Forrester on 2 occasions with great research there. You're an executive resident at Progress Partners and currently EVP Innovation at R3. So welcome, Joanna.
Thank you so much.
And Ian Whittaker, my I would say pretty longtime friend at this point. Ian, as many of you probably know as well, a very well-known equity analyst from his equity analyst days in London. He is board advisor on several companies in the media, tech, and sporting space. I think one of the more interesting things is what he's been doing in the last, say, year or so is teaching how to speak the language of the CFO to marketing executives, which is becoming, I think, more and more important. Ian and I have agreed on this for quite some time. He's on podcasts. He's a contributor to many things. And he also has a newsletter called The Bigger Picture, which folks should subscribe to because it's really good macro type of view of the advertising media space and other things as well. I'm your host, Tom Triscari. So I'm a board advisor to several companies doing mostly corporate development work. I run a newsletter called Quo Vadis, which I think many folks already know. If you don't, you should check it out. And with that, we will get into this topic. Okay, so I'm going to give a little bit. This is your show for Joanna and Ian. So I'm going to give a little bit of a preamble to set things up. Joanna with the longer experience in programmatic than Ian, but Ian obviously covers a lot of this area tangentially. He's well informed on the space as well. So our subject at hand today is as advances in identity-based buying culture, right, have changed, the traditional rules that govern economics, programmatic have also changed and are likely to change because of this shift in identity. And so although price and ad quality are still very important to understand, and we know that lots of advertisers still struggle with this value equation of price and quality, the new factor, or not so new anymore, but the factor that's been hanging around is cookie deprecation and how it's tied to privacy compliance and signal availability. And that, of course, makes changes in the overall scale of identity going forward. So what we want to explore here is the new normal, or as Rashad Tabakawala might frame it as the new strange, as he did during the pandemic days. But we'll frame it as the new normal. So with that, I want to start by offering just a baseline and then let you two go at it and I'll moderate the rest of it. But let's go back in time. Programmatic is synonymous with audience targeting. There's no distinction in my mind between these two things, meaning programmatic was invented and innovated upon to do impression level audience targeting. Audience targeting requires an identifier to get it done, to get that job done. And buyers today, they really don't buy media per se anymore. What they really demand is they want to buy audiences. There's a media that the audiences ride upon, but they are audience first buyers in most cases. So if third-party cookies were the foundation upon which audience targeting functioned, and if third-party cookies are 70% gone and soon to be 100% gone, therefore that I arrive at this conclusion from a theoretical economist point of view, that if the demand for audience targeting is held constant, yet the supply of audience targeting capabilities is facing a shock, like a supply shock, where the supply curve shifts backwards, or verticalizes, but if there's a shift or a change in supply of the ability to audience target, then what happens in the future? For example, normally, if you have a constant demand and a shift in supply backwards, prices go up. The prices buyers are willing to pay for identity would go up. So let's start there with my assessment and that foundation I laid out. And I always ask myself this sort of McKinsey type thing, which is, well, how wrong could I be and how much might it change my answer? Am I a little bit wrong, but our answer is the same? Or could I be a lot wrong And the answer is still the same or very different. So, I'll start with Joanna on that, and then we'll kick it right to Ian. But go ahead with that preamble setup.
So, well, I'll start by saying it's interesting that you sort of talked about programmatic as being synonymous with audience targeting from the beginning. And I think that's both correct and actually not correct. I mean, I remember in the early days, we just liked the idea that we could use any kind of signal to make a decision. And that signal could be something like a contextual signal. It could be something like an audience signal, but it was about having like this whole kind of rich array of choices upon which you could make a decision to buy or not buy and at what price. Practically speaking, though, you're right. It really was sort of fundamentally, ultimately about audience targeting. But it was also about just getting access to media cheap. Like, let's be honest, that's not necessarily what we wanted to be true as idealistic early programmatic, buyers, but a lot of it was just sort of getting more direct access to tonnage, rather than having to be disintermediated by a whole bunch of ad networks that were doing all this sort of hopping and arbing. And a lot of the early programmatic stuff, I think, was based on that. To your point around audience targeting, a lot of it also was based on the very simple presence or absence of a cookie. And this was your point, right? And in a world where cookies are absent, something that is very lucrative for, I think, a lot of networks and other kinds of sellers, which is retargeting, is existentially threatened and creates a lot of problems.
Joanna, it's almost like in that way you just said, it's almost like we had a free good, meaning third-party cookies were practically like air or water. They were almost free to be exposed, and then all the cookie syncing would take place to actually sync everything up so you could do audience targeting. Now we enter a world where, well, wait a minute, that free good has gone away in some sense.
I mean, that's a fair point. Although I would say we also did a great job of abusing that free good, right? Having like a great job, like, having access to cookies gave you all kinds of power. And you could do all kinds of terrible things like mess with attribution systems and retarget consumers into oblivion. So we sure did a good job doing a bad thing with something that was, as you said, for all intents and purposes, very available and free. So fair point there. That is shifting into a world of uncertainty that I think at this point is very unsettled. I mean, we're so far, I think, from people actually being prepared for a world without cookies. Like, let's just be honest, because it keeps being delayed, people keep having more time, people keep taking more time to not necessarily get prepared. But the good news is, in the meantime, the industry is doing all kinds of interesting stuff, like coming up with new ways to target that might not be the sort of traditional, I will address a person, and let's be clear, a cookie is not a person, it's a browser, it's a cookie on a browser. Right. But I will address, some kind of individual entity. A lot of the targeting, I think, capabilities that are starting to appear actually don't necessitate that and aren't built for that. So I raised that in the context of an identity conversation very, very purposely, because we have to think about a future of targeting that is much more expansive and has lots of different ways in which we think about targeting that don't necessarily have to mean targeting an individual.
Right, exactly. So now, Ian, what are your thoughts on that, on this starting point of, what I mentioned about, what used to be a free good and the supply curve kind of changes? Do we see, for example, a price that a buyer, you have a lot of experience on both the brand side and on the agency side and understanding the way they think and how they're operating, and they want to target audiences as much as possible. So therefore, if that demand is there and the supply is changing, what do you expect to see?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, I'll start off by saying, obviously, sort of, I'm not sort of as much in the details of these as yourself and Joanna, who've far more experience when it gets down into the details of what's happening than I necessarily would. I would make one general observation I would say from the start is I am somewhat skeptical of whether cookies will indeed be faded out sort of at the end of next year. We've had delays before, and quite frankly, it wouldn't surprise me that we have more delays. If I look at the timescale that's been proposed, in terms of when this is supposed to ramp up, a hockey stick curve effect, as it were. You start off with a couple of companies testing, and then as the year progresses, you're supposed to get more and more coming through. That seems like a classic recipe for delay. But let's put that to one side as to what happens with cookies and come back to the economics point. You're absolutely right. In a market where essentially you, as you suggest, that there is a demand for a product, but the supply has been shifted, then what you should see is essentially the price of the product that would go up. One question I would have, though, is whether in a way, so there's a more fundamental question here, which is essentially whether demand for that product will be there or not. And the reason why I mention this is that if you look at what's happened over the past 18 months, and it's a theme that, I've been talking about a lot, Tom, it is, given what's happened with advertisers being able to push through much greater price increases to consumers as anticipated, what there seems now to be a much greater focus on is very much outcome-based solutions.
Yes.
And what happens there. So the question I think really needs to be asked as to, when we're thinking about identity and so identity-based solutions, where it really fits in that changing trend. Because
Are you referring to say Omnicom and some of the things that Brian Weiser has brought up around the big portion of principal-based trading and where revenue is coming from, meaning those are outcome-based models, meaning I'm willing to give you my money, you use my money as long as I get the outcome, and you're making whatever that margin is in between. And then therefore, with identity changing, how much is identity an ingredient in that outcome-based model?
It's part of that, but I think it's also as well just a wider thing that's happened as well. One of the things that you've heard from companies on conference calls over the past, particularly 2 to 3 quarters, are companies turning around and saying, well, the reason we've been able to push through these much greater than anticipated price increases to consumers is because of the strength of our brand. And I think what that has done is that for many of these advertisers, and it's very much of a vast unplanned experiment, what has gone on with regard to the sort of price increases that we've seen sort of being absorbed by the consumer, is that it's starting to make them fundamentally reevaluate how they look at marketing. What we'd say is that very much the conversation for the past almost 10 years when it comes to marketing has almost been one that's been driven more by the process than necessarily the outcome on there. How you measure things, your debate over cookies, and so forth. And I think what we're starting to see now is a shift where actually what people are more focusing on is the end result. Now, it could be argued that was always the intention anyway, but certainly when it came to from an outsider standpoint, and certainly looking into what was happening, very much of the debate was really focused, to me anyway, seemed very much focused around the process. That to me is where I think there is a big underlying fundamental shift going on. And I think a lot of it is being driven by people very much at the top of management teams, sort of having, as it were, an epiphany. And that really starting to feed down through the organization. Michael Farmer did a very good interview, but I think it was the head of procurement AstraZeneca, sort of where it was talking about the changes there that they're seeing in terms of their agencies going from being seen as suppliers really to being strategic partners. And I think this is where, if we're talking about identity solutions, I think this is where sort of the whole concept of identity really needs to be tied more firmly into what is the outcome. Because the concern is that what you would have, and this is, again, taking the sort of Economist analogy a little bit further, is that yes, the supply may have been shifted and things may be different, but are we talking about a market that is still fundamentally present, or are we talking something like market for, let's say, horsewhips, where essentially the market has died out? And so I think it was looking from an identity standpoint, I was thinking from an economist standpoint and a market standpoint. That's where I think the debate needs to be more focused on at the moment.
Yeah. Now, you had mentioned real quick, and I want to just, before we switch gears, I want to ask you both a real quick answer on this. So you had said you were skeptical that Google will hold this date.
Mm-hmm.
So independent of how much I would be willing to wager, if I went to the London, bookmakers, or I went to the Vegas bookmakers, and I said, hey guys, I got this money. What kind of odds are you going to give me? So you're telling me that if I'm willing to bet that it's going to happen, you're willing to put up money saying that it's not, right? As a
Yeah,
bookmaker.
yeah. I mean, I wouldn't gamble the house on it. I mean, I think my wife would be, wouldn't be happy if I did. But, I think, yeah, I think there's a reasonable chance that we get another knockback again. And again, I'm looking for something from an outsider's point of view. It doesn't really feel as though the industry is there at the moment, nor indeed has made a huge amount of progress. Yes, there's this deadline and it's been pushed back and so forth. But certainly the feedback that it doesn't feel as though people are really sort of raring to go, anticipating this, thinking this is a great opportunity.
Yeah. And Joanna, what do you think? Joanna, I mean, what is that? Does it matter if it is delayed?
Yeah.
If it's delayed by a quarter or two, is it going to really matter in the long run?
Right. I mean, in the meantime, we have to think about the fact that the privacy conversation is so much bigger than what Google does with the third-party cookie.
Yeah.
We have privacy legislation in like 70% of countries, right? And like Europe is so much further down this journey than is the United States. And that train it's left the station, right? We know that you look at companies like Apple that have made major changes in the availability of consumer data for the purposes of advertising. And Google is a monster company under a huge amount of pressure. Sorry. Alphabet is a monster company under a huge amount of pressure from a lot of angles. And so to imagine that they can kind of get away with not doing the thing that they said that they were going to do when they're under so much pressure, to me seems unreasonable. So I think Ian's point is fair. I mean, they sure have gotten away with pushing it a lot of times. And I get why, we need to have something. You don't want the industry to crash around your feet. But it has to happen on a certain level because the energy around creating a different kind of experience for consumers when it comes to the sort of access to their data and the value exchange, like that ship has sailed. The train has left the station. What else? The car's left the driveway. You know what I mean? So we should be preparing for that.
There's another factor in there with Google as well, which you could both comment on just really quickly, because there's another subject we have to move on to, but you just mentioned something. So just this morning, like every day now, I'm typing something into ChatGPT that I would almost normally have typed into Google search. Okay. There's a lot of CPCs that just aren't there anymore. Do you know what I mean? In other words, every time someone does something in ChatGPT that they normally did in Google, that to me is now Google's biggest pressure point, because that's where all their revenue still comes from. Meaning that's a much bigger problem than the cookie problem and in what they call network property line of business, which last time I checked, Ian, was something like a $36 billion business, network properties.
Yeah.
Still very sizable compared to the rest of ad tech, but 97% or whatever the revenues are search related. Therefore, to me, that's a much bigger problem. I got to be.
Oh yeah, their entire empire is funded on paid search advertising. Like, let's just be really crystal clear about that. If we're gonna let's not even go down the path of ChatGPT, because here's the thing that also creates massive problems for publishers who get traffic from referral from search. So it's man, oh man, right? There's all kinds of questions that raises. But to bring it back to identity for a second, that is a thing that a publisher can say, hey, this is a thing that I have that has value to you as an advertiser. And to tie it to Ian's point, but only if it works, right? This outcomes conversation is the right one, because fundamentally the media needs to perform.
Exactly.
So it always comes back to measurement, always, always, always. And if you actually have conversations with big brands, that's what they focus on. We talk identity and targeting and all this stuff, and they're like, I just need to know that it's working or how it's working, and I need to know where and how to invest my dollars, like fundamentally, right?
And I think that's the critical point that Joanna's saying, that essentially for many companies, they just want to have comfort with knowing that what they are spending on and what they are doing is correct. And I think this is the fundamental issue that many of them face with the elimination of cookies and the move on to a new system at the moment. They're in this sort of this gray zone, as it were, where I wouldn't say they have 100% comfort. What they need to do is move there as quickly as possible. Yeah, and this is, sorry, go on, Tom.
Go ahead, Joanna, because that's a great way to segue into the next thing, but go ahead, Joanna.
I was just going to say, one sort of last point on the outcomes piece, though, there's no way the big sophisticated brands are willing to trade outcomes for black boxes. So the future kind of has to be some way to find a path transparently toward performance. I just struggle believing that the really big ones are going to be comfortable going back to a world where they say, no problem, you just get me the performance and I'll give you the money. You know what I mean?
Or the vanity performance.
Or the vanity forget. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. Yeah.
I
Right.
think that's true. And I think the agencies, what's gone on with things like Xaxis and so forth in the past, I think absolutely right. I'd agree with that. That was maybe a mindset that would have been tolerated 5-6 years ago. Definitely not now.
I remember a panel discussion at Le Rooftop in Cannes. This is in 2016, where Brian Lesser was talking about then saying we're moving toward a value-based world. We're just not there yet, but that's where it's going. And that's where he saw, this world going, which is an outcome-based world. The trouble back then was, how do you figure out how to monetize it as an agency and keep what you've been able to get for your clients and keep a fair share of that surplus value without, for example, maybe procurement trying to beat you up on fees and take it away when you've done this performance and earned your fees for your shareholders. Now with that, so shifting gears here and keeping things within this sort of context of economics and identity, just looking at my notes here. So think about one of the fundamental thing of microeconomics is a trade-off curve, and they're sometimes known as utility curves or preference curves. And a trade-off curve in this sense would be, from an identity perspective, is you're always trading off accuracy for scale. I will give up some scale for more accuracy, or vice versa. In the case of third-party cookies, you were definitely on the high scale, and there was a lot of scale. Accuracy, of course, is you could argue whether much accuracy was there at all, or the sort of the vanity of accuracy. So in a first-party data world that we're shifting to, or I just say first-party data world, or a new identity, a new way to get the audience targeting job done, as Joanna referred to earlier, could be contextual signals, could be all sorts of different signals, right? What would you guys expect to see, given this discussion about outcome-based, fundamentals? I would expect to see a shift in the utility curves, meaning that we're going to end up that buyers, advertisers will end up getting more utility out of whatever's coming next of how to do identity-based advertising than what they had with third-party cookies. In other words, that trade-off curve, there'll be some trade-off between accuracy and scale, but you're shifting out to more utility with these new solutions that have been forced upon everyone. Joanna, you go ahead. Do you think that's I'm making case there?
Yeah, I mean, so one quick comment. I think the outcome-based fundamentals thing has a lot more nuance than we have time to talk about. Maybe an outcomes-oriented mindset. I'm a little bit more comfortable with that than sort of committing to the whole industry moving to outcome-based models. Just had to say it out loud. But that said, you raise a really interesting point. Cookies are binary. It's there or it's not there. The conversation around identity is necessarily many shades of gray, where it may be something like authenticated by brand, authenticated by publisher, the match has been done, I know definitively, using an identity resolution solution that we are talking about, the anonymized version of Joanna, that is very different than, a modeled audience that is built using, probabilistic techniques and maybe some deterministic stuff. So instead of saying, it's there or it's not, you have to start saying, what are the trade-offs I'm making on price, on performance, on accuracy? And that's just so much more complicated, that's just going to take people a while to wade through all that complexity, because it doesn't necessarily mean that you're saying I have an answer to identity. You're saying instead, I have a range of use cases that I need to take care of. What are the ways I want to tackle that? There are all these identity solutions out there. Might one fit one situation, but not another? If you need to get it right and know that it's Joanna O'Connell, from a customer service standpoint, you're going to use somebody that really knows that it's Joanna O'Connell and has done the hard work of doing identity resolution to feel confident in that. That's not the same as I want to target green moms.
Right. Yeah, that's a much, like you're saying, defining it as sort of what is the job you're trying to get done and what tools do I need to go get that job done. And they could be different than just, which was sort of this sort of like, you know, if all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, right? So if all you have is programmatic, every problem looks like a cookie type of thing. But that's now gone. And the toolbox kind of opens up to different things to get specific jobs done. That it sounds like, you know, those jobs ultimately coalesce around something that's outcome driven in some way, shape, or form.
Theoretically, right? I mean, I'm with you guys. That's what it should be. It should be about some kind of performance that ultimately leads to business performance. So for sure. But the price then becomes another lever, right? So presence or absence of cookie, very binary, but I must be sure that it's this person, you know, must come with a premium versus I need to reach an audience that may be a lesser premium. And that should be part of the equation.
Yeah. So Ian, what are your thoughts on that? And I have a special little follow-up on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, so I'm going to answer it in a slightly different way. I think if you look at what has, and it will answer the question, if you look at sort of one of perhaps the greatest shifts in marketing over the past 10 years, but probably something that hasn't been commented on a huge amount, is that marketing has gone from being an industry where you could argue that it was too loose in terms of its measurement, to one where it's almost treated like an empirical science on here, that if you do X, then you will get Y in terms of the outcome. And indeed, if you think about it, that is something that probably suits the big platforms such as Facebook and Google very well. It plays very much to their strengths in terms of this. I mean, this is why you get in terms of attribution models that are been accepted by these providers. And I raised that point because when you look at sort of this whole thing of the trade-offs, I think what everyone in the industry has been looking for was the perfect solution. And it's been driven very much by this mindset sort of that talk about is that marketing increasingly being seen as this empirical science. And I think increasingly what you're going to get is that what people realize is that perfect is the enemy of good.
Mm-hmm.
But what you'll realize is there'll be a greater acceptance that, yes, we'll never get the perfect solution, but actually what's necessary now and moving forwards is just to have a common standard that we accept as flaws. Maybe we can improve on over time, but it's a common standard that's accepted by all, and to move forward to that. And that's typically how progress is made across industries. But when you look at where time is wasted, where things get delayed, it normally becomes in that people have agreed on 90% and they're trying to get extra 10% perfect. I think what sort of almost need in this debate, and again, this is looking from an outsider's point of view, is that what you almost need in this debate is to realize that any solution that come up with in this area is going to have flaws. There's going to be issues with it.
This feels so important because you raised such an important point, the sort of understanding of standards or some basic agreement. I had this really interesting conversation as part of this research I was doing with Sim on the data clean room space. And they were talking about this particular interview was talking about the fact that identity providers are trying to differentiate on things that should just get standardized, like how many people are in a household. Or how many households there are. How about that? How many households there are? Where they should be differentiating is on things like the understanding of the people in the household. So we can't even get that figured out right now. You know, we have kind of conversation and debate and competitive moves around some of the things that theoretically would, if we could standardize our understanding of, would make this a lot simpler and a lot more scaled.
Yeah. So I know that we're coming up on time here. So I want to just kind of wrap up with just the last 2 or 3 minutes. So I think this last subject area, you know, is I wish we had more time to get further into this, because we start to go into these really, I think we would all find as super interesting areas. So one last thing and a quick answer. So in 1985, there was a paper, an econ paper written by an economist named Jeffrey Bergstrand, tenured professor, long time at Notre Dame. And It's a paper called The Gravity Theory of Trade, in which this paper, they researched all the import-export data. So the data was very clean from governments, et cetera, on import-exports and things moving on ships and airplanes. And they found basically that what predicts trade between two countries is the size of the country and their proximity to each other, right? So Canada and the US trade a lot. They're both big. They're next to each other. Maybe Nicaragua and Mozambique, they're very far away, smaller economies. They don't trade that much. But one of the things I've been floating is, well, what does that mean in a walled garden world where every company, streaming companies, publishers, advertisers, everyone, retail media, they're all walled gardens of some shape or size. They're all guarding and locking down their data. Is there a play in the world where data will get traded in the same way, in that same idea of the gravity theory of trade, where these like parties will find ways and mutually beneficial outcomes to trade data? Is that a place where we're going with clean rooms? And
literally no way to
subject.
answer that in 1 minute, but
yeah, in 2 seconds, Joanna. And
no, but in short, I mean, that I think that is the promise of some of the work around the future of data collaboration is how do you create systems that allow for data collaboration without having to move data around, and also with less movement of data, and also with a lot more stringent rules and guidelines on how the data is used, what data is accessed by whom, and for what use cases, so that you don't have to worry so much about data being leaked or lost. Rather, you can worry about data as an asset and how to value it.
That benefits the outcome-based piece. But go ahead, Ian, and finish it.
Yeah, in 30 seconds, what would say? I mean, you sort of you're both know this, but one of the biggest boosts you can get to free trade is essentially seamless trade between. And so if data clean rooms, if they do as they are promised, and as Joanna was saying, sort of they reduce the amount of loss in the system, they facilitate trade to all two parties, then what you would naturally expect is that should naturally boost, as it were, interactions between the two parties.
Yeah,
exactly. I wish we had more time on that. Maybe we could just take that offline because it's such an interesting subject. Well, guys, pleasure. Thank you for doing this on behalf of ID5. So enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully if we get some good follow-up and folks see this, you can always email us or contact us or direct message any one of us on LinkedIn with any questions. Thank you, guys.
thanks so much.
Take care. Bye.